Our teens are meant to be the best years of our lives. We have our whole lives ahead of us, no real responsibility, and feel totally invincible. So when a young life is cut short, it shakes communities and ruins lives, especially when that life is taken by another person. I know that as a teen, I've never thought anyone would want to do something to hurt me, let alone kill me. Today, we are looking at a case that took place in the last place anyone would expect, a sleepy town in England. When a young woman turned up dead in a town that hadn't had a murder in 30 years, it changed the lives of her friends and family forever. This is the story of Heather Tell. Heather Tell was born in Tamworth, a market town in the county of Staffordshire, England. By all accounts, Heather was cheerful, kind, and always smiling. In the year 2000, Heather was a few weeks away from turning 18 and studying performing arts at Sutton College, who say she was a very talented student with a bright future. In August, she and her friend, Laura Ravenhill, made plans to go to the movies and arranged to meet at Belgrave's Studio of Dance. Even though it was the summer, by the time Heather left her home at 8:30 p.m., it was already starting to get dark. She lived with her dad and younger sister Holly, who both knew Heather planned to go out that evening. Her dad even planned to drive Heather to the movies himself, but she decided to walk because he needed to go to a meeting with his accountant. According to her neighbor, he saw her leave her house and waved to her. She waved back and said hello before going on her way. This may have been the last time she was seen alive. She decided to take a shortcut through Kettlebrook Linear Park, sometimes known as Belgrave Lakes because of how close it was to the dance studio. Once she entered that park, no one fully knows what happened to her. Heather never made it to the meeting point, and Laura started to get worried when she didn't arrive. It would have only taken 30 minutes to walk through the park, and according to Laura, Heather was the kind of person that would let someone know if she was going to be late. This was made even stranger by the fact that Heather was carrying her cell phone and hadn't used it to contact her friend. Laura called Heather's dad, who of course told her that Heather had left already and should have made it there by now. It became obvious to them both that something had happened to disrupt Heather's journey, so her dad called the police and reported her missing. It didn't take long for the authorities to arrive at the park and begin an in-depth search. It was dark out by this point, so they brought police dogs and helicopters to better their chances of finding Heather. The park was surrounded by dense trees and bushes, so it was important that they used all the methods they could to find her if she was trapped in a hidden part of the park. Despite their best efforts, it was no use. Heather was nowhere to be found. The weather had also put them at a disadvantage, as it had started raining heavily just before they started looking. The search was called off for the night, and all anyone could do was pray that she would turn up alive. By the next morning, any hopes of finding Heather alive were shattered. Ryan Hooper, a family friend, ventured to the park that morning and noticed something strange in the undergrowth near the edge of the park. He got closer to see for himself what it was, and to his horror, he accidentally discovered Heather's body. According to reports, Heather was found without any of her clothes on, and the only clothing found was her socks and underwear. A short distance from where she was left, police found Heather's phone, which had been snapped in half. They later discovered that at 8:41 p.m., she'd attempted to call her dad. They suspected this was when she realized she was in danger. It was clear to investigators straight away how Heather had died. Around her neck was a thin red line, the kind consistent with someone who had been strangled. Nearby, they found her shoelaces, and it was determined they were used in the crime. Tamworth went into shock when it was announced what happened to Heather. This just wasn't the kind of place where stuff like this happened. Tamworth was somewhere that people felt safe and didn't feel the need to be afraid of their neighbors. After this, people were scared to leave their homes, and a town that was once vibrant and busy pretty much shut down. Even though the night before it rained pretty badly, the investigators were still able to find some evidence to help them catch Heather's killer. They recovered some DNA from the scene, but it couldn't be matched to anyone in their system. Since this was in 2000, the technology wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now, and that made it much harder to catch criminals. However, one thing that they did have was a profile of the person that likely killed Heather. The fact that they'd taken Heather's clothes was very telling, as behavior like this usually means the criminal already has a history of committing crimes of a certain nature, if you catch my drift. Something that did surprise the investigators was that nothing was done to Heather besides her cause of death. Considering her lack of clothing, they would have expected a more gruesome crime scene. An appeal was put out into the media asking for anyone with potential information to come forward and help them solve the case. Joe Haynes Prince came forward and said he was in the park close to the time that Heather would have been there. He claimed to have seen another man there who caught his attention because he was acting strangely. According to Joe Haynes, the man was in his 40s or 50s 20s, wearing a blue tracksuit, and was walking at the edge of the park, trying to keep his face covered. The case also caught the attention of an 18-year-old girl named Lindsay Chidgey. Lindsay was from Tamworth, and the case was playing heavily on her mind as she worked her part-time job at Partners Stationery Store. She was just a little older than Heather, and she had an idea of who could have caused the death of this poor girl. She confided in some of her friends at work that she suspected her dad was guilty of the crime. Lindsay's father, Michael Chidgey, a coach driver, had a dark history and had committed some truly awful crimes against women and young girls when Lindsay was a kid. He hadn't come home the night Heather was murdered, but when he returned the next morning, he was soaking wet, claiming he got lost while out on a walk. Lindsay's work friends tipped off the police straight away, and they took Michael in for questioning. Of course, he denied having anything to do with Heather's death, and even supplied them with a DNA sample, a decision he would come to regret later. His DNA matched the sample they found at the crime scene. There was a 1 in 70 million chance that it would belong to someone other than Michael Chidgey. Michael gave an interesting excuse as to how his DNA was found at the scene. He admitted to the police that he had a fascination with women's lingerie and would often go into stores to look at, feel, and sometimes buy items of women's underwear. He suggested that Heather must have been wearing underwear he'd come into contact with at a store, and she just so happened to have bought them and worn them on the night she died. You can guess that the police did not buy this theory, and Michael was arrested a month after Heather died. Michael's trial took place at Stafford Crown Court, and deciding his guilt came easily to the jury. Along with the evidence mentioned, it was discovered that Michael had been making inappropriate phone calls to women in the days leading up to Heather's murder. All that, along with his criminal history, made it clear he was the one that caused Heather's death. The trial was attended by Heather's friends and family, who all wore sprigs of heather attached to their coats and jackets as a sign of remembrance. They cheered and applauded as Michael was sentenced to life in prison. With the killer behind bars, Heather could finally be put to rest. Hundreds of flowers were placed under a tree a few yards from where her body was discovered. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people who lined the streets to pay their respects to Heather. Since then, Heather's parents have campaigned to give the public better access to information about criminals who may be on registers because of their danger to society. They collaborated with another family, Michael and Sarah Payne, to make changes to that law that could prevent crimes like these. Michael and Sarah also lost their daughter, Sarah, in 2000, and her cause of death was similar to Heather's. Sarah's law was finally created in 2010 and allows parents to access information through the police about people who come into contact with their children, such as teachers or a new partner. Although Sarah's law was too late to save these victims, it's allowed hundreds of other families to protect themselves against people like Michael Chidgey. That brings us to the end of today's video. What do you think of this case? I can't wait to read your thoughts and opinions down in the comments.